In an interview for The Guardian this week, prominent gender theorist Judith Butler was quoted as saying that gender-critical feminism is, quote, one of the most dominant strains of fascism of our time. In this, she is following a new trend originating from social media, of course, of presuming that anyone who disagrees with you is a Nazi. And this is particularly common now among those who support the highly contested notion of gender identity ideology. Stonewall, for instance, now routinely smears anyone who raises concerns about this new way of thinking as hateful or transphobic. Debate and discussion, it seems, amounts to a kind of violence, which is a shame for any of us who still care about basic liberal values. So here to discuss Judith Butler's comments is Dr. Jane Clare Jones, a feminist, philosopher, feminist writer, feminist activist. As she points out on her website, you may notice a theme. Dr. Jones, thank you very much for joining me today.
Good evening.
I wanted to ask you first about Judith Butler's comments, because I know they were published in The Guardian and then they were removed from The Guardian. And I think a lot of people will be confused about precisely what it was she was criticising. Can you just, in a brief way, outline what is meant by gender identity ideology and what Judith Butler's view about that is?
Well, Judith Butler's view about this is quite complicated because there's what Judith Butler has written in her books, which, according to what she's written in her book, she really shouldn't be supporting gender identity ideology because she's not supposed to believe in essential identities. But actually, it turns out that she's very, very happy to go along with this political project. And gender identity ideology has two main aspects to it. One is the belief that people have an innate gender identity, and the other is the belief that sex is not really a real phenomenon. And so the ideological movement that is pushing this is basically wanting for us to reorganize public space or services and the law around the idea that whether people are a man or a woman is to do with their gender identity and not to do with sex. So it's a kind of gender identity trumps sex idea is the basic idea.
And I've seen you talking about this notion that a lot of people will accuse those, particularly feminists who are what we call gender critical. Feminists who, in other words, believe that gender is a social construct, as in this idea that boys innately wear blue, girls wear pink, and they enjoy like princesses and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they was, but a lot of people say that for some reason you're siding with conservatives on this. And what do you make of that accusation?
What I would say is that there's actually three it's getting confused because there are three separate positions.
Okay.
And the gender identity activists want to collapse it into two positions. So they want to say there are people who agree with us and everyone who disagrees with us is conservative.
And what are
there's actually three.
What are those?
The three positions are the conservatives generally believe that sex is real, and then they believe that sex determines gender or gender identity. So boys like blue and trains and trucks and fighting and girls like pink and princesses and sparkles.
And that's biologically determined, the conservatives would say.
And that's, yes. And then they tend to argue that all of the power structures and the allocation of social roles and the allocation of labour and everything that follows from that kind of follows naturally from these biological bases. So that's more or less the conservative position, right? The feminist position is that humans are sexed, and that is a biological reality, and that sex is a reproductive function. So female people get pregnant and male people inseminate female people. And then there are some aspects of our social labour, like the fact that, women breastfeed infants, that might have something to do with our biology. Mm-hmm. But then pretty much everything else, what kind of personalities you're allowed to, what kind of characteristics you're allowed to express, how you're supposed to dress, whether you're allowed to be assertive or kind or gentle or emotional or any of these things, that should not be determined by sex. And that actually, if you look at humans, it's fairly obvious that most human beings have a mixture of these traits. And then we tend to try and force male humans into one of these boxes and female humans into another of these boxes. And we think that's not good. Okay. That's the feminist position. The gender identity position is that whether you're a man or a woman is determined by this innate thing called gender identity, and your sex is irrelevant. So in a certain sense, both conservatives and gender identity activists believe that gender is innate, and conservatives and feminists agree that sex exists. But there are three different positions because we're rejecting the idea that sex is. Gender critical feminism consists of two views. One, sex real. Two, gender is mostly socially constructed.
Yes.
Right. But because we won't accept that gender identity should trump sex, and we won't accept that sex is like a made up, was invented by colonialism or whatever they say, they are trying to say that we're allied.
Yes, I mean...
Basically, it's like everyone that thinks the sky is blue is a Nazi. Everyone that thinks sex exists has the same political belief, which is crazy.
A typical kind of guilt by association thing. It's like when some reactionary bigot defends free speech, that doesn't make free speech wrong as a principle. It just because that person has some other horrendous views. And this is right. It sounds like a similar kind of thing that's going on here. But the word fascism is so extreme. I mean, for someone in the public eye like Judith Butler to call people... I mean, isn't that is raising the temperature in quite an irresponsible way, isn't it?
I mean, that temperature has been raised by gender identity activists or trans activists progressively over the last 5 or 6 years. So the accusation itself is not uncommon, right? I mean, I'm a left-wing radical feminist, but I'm frequently accused of being a Nazi because I believe humans are sexed.
That was Hitler's big thing, wasn't it? Clearly.
Well, but it's like the level of Hitler was a vegetarian, so therefore vegetarians are Nazis. We're at that kind of level of tenuousness at this stage. But for the thing about Judith Butler's role, I mean, and this has happened, this is not the first time. Over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, Judith Butler basically gets dispatched to the British media to tell off gender critical feminists. Mm-hmm. And this has happened in the New Statesman a couple of times over the last couple of years. And it's to do with the fact that gender critical feminism is mounting a relatively successful defense against the imposition of gender identity ideology on British, and not on, the institutions of British feminism are completely captured, but there's a very successful kind of grassroots resistance to the imposition of gender identity ideology, which is largely an American thing. So basically, Judith Butler gets dispatched to kind of tell us that we are bad and evil and wrong. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting is that in this particular instance, with the Guardian article, there was a big mess, because the comments about us being fascists were attached to this issue about what had happened at the Wee Spa.
Yes.
And what had happened at the Wee Spa, it had transpired, was that someone with multiple, background convictions for sexual offences had gone and exposed themselves to a woman and a young girl.
Yes.
And it had turned out that person actually is a serial sexual predator. So
they removed the section of the interview because it was on dodgy ground legally in terms of what she'd said about that particular incident. But that paragraph contains... I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, it didn't exactly say that we were fascists. What it said is that people who oppose gender identity ideology are fascists. Yes. And TERFs are, or gender critical feminists are, she called us TERFs actually, are allied with this, and therefore, so she didn't say we're fascists, she said they're kind of making alliances with fascists. Right, I see.
And being against gender identity is like one of the big, major threads of fascism. And so then it was more kind of like you're fascist adjacent, fascist allied, and you're not going. But effectively, the reason why I think the Guardian messed up, right? The Guardian should have left it in there.
Yeah.
I think what happened is that it was edited and produced by the US Guardian, and there is gender identity ideology is an American phenomenon, which is being exported around the world, which is ironic because they keep talking about, how they're against colonialism, except they're taking this American ideology and imposing it on various countries around the world. So it was basically the US Guardian had produced this piece and they hadn't bothered to check it properly. So when it became clear that the WeSpa, they had not put in a clarification about the WeSpa incident, what they should have done is add a note saying it has, the individual at the centre of the WeSpa incident has now been arrested and also has form for indecent exposure. And then they should have let Judith Butler stand there in public calling feminist women fascist adjacent for objecting to a serial sexual predator exposing himself to children.
Right. I mean, I think letting her speak is the best way in these situations. And I think cutting it out is a mistake. But what do you make of the continual accusation that feminists like yourself, what they call TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, want to erase trans people's existence, don't believe in equal rights for trans people? This is the accusation I'm hearing an awful lot. How would you respond to that?
Right. I mean, firstly, we do not want to erase trans people's existence. Trans people exist. The issue is what is the legal status of trans people, and specifically, what is the legal status of trans women vis-a-vis women? Because what is under the bracket of trans rights, I mean, and it's being framed in terms of equality, but the claim that's actually being made is that male people who were born male and then transition to being women or socially performing a role or wanting to be recognized as women should have exactly the same rights as female people, and that female people are not allowed any spaces or political organizing or services that are dedicated entirely for female people. So it's not just a request for equal rights, it's a request for the rights of female people. And that is that's a new thing in civil rights history. Most rights movements have asked to be recognized as themselves, not to be recognized as another group of people who already exist.
It does sound to me that with such a difficult and sensitive and tenacious topic, it does require a lot of conversation, and it does require people to sit down together, not call each other fascists, and have a conversation about how best to move forward with this obvious conflict that isn't going away. Just one final question, Dr. Jones. Do you think in the current climate, with the temperature raised to the extent that it has been, do you think those kind of discussions will ever happen? I mean,
it is our hope, and we have said since the beginning that we want to sit down, and we're like, there is a rights conflict. We need to sit down and we need to work out how to negotiate this so that we can come to some kind of accommodation which tries to meet everyone's needs. But there are some trans people who are willing to do that, but gender identity ideology is very insistent that gender identity must trump sex. So there's no space within that ideology for women to say, no, actually, under these set of circumstances, we need this to be organised according to sex. So we need female people to have a right to ask for a female counsellor in a rape crisis centre, or we need female people to ask to have a healthcare practitioner doing a cervical smear to be female. And that's not an unreasonable thing. That it can't be accommodated inside the ideology, because the ideology is entirely about gender identity must trump sex. And if you don't agree, you're a white supremacist or a Nazi or some kind of bigot. So there's no space for the structure of the ideology doesn't allow there to be a space to recognize that women have any legitimate concerns or that any of our claims are reasonable. And, negotiation can only start when both sides will recognize something in the other's position. And you could say, I understand what is motivating trans people, right? I understand you want to be validated, that you feel discriminated against, that you feel unrecognized, that you need certain services. I see that. The problem is that some of the things you're demanding are in conflict with but unless you recognize that we also have some legitimate needs and legitimate concerns, we can't move forward because there's nowhere to negotiate from. And that's kind of where we're stuck.
Well, thank you for outlining that problem so eloquently for us, Dr. Jones, and thank you for joining us today.